The air smelled of smoke and death, and the sounds of the city collapsing echoed through every shattered building. But it wasn't the gunfire, or the explosions, or even the looting that terrified me most. No. It was what came after dark. They never told us it would get this bad. When the fighting first broke out in Khartoum, we thought it was just another skirmish, another battle between military factions vying for control. We were used to it. Working as humanitarian aid workers, danger had become part of the job. But by the time the sun dipped below the horizon on the third night, we realized that this conflict was something different, something far more sinister. I'd been in Sudan for almost 6 months, working in a cramped office with outdated computers and makeshift clinics that dotted the city. The people were desperate, their lives hanging in the balance as the fighting closed in around us. But even in the chaos, there was always hope. At least, until the shadows began to move. The first time I saw one, I was on my way back to the safe house. I hadn't even thought twice about going out at night before, but that evening felt different. The streets were quieter than usual. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. The air was thick with tension, and the only light came from the flickering remains of burning cars. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a shadow. But it wasn't cast by the flames, and it wasn't mine. It slid along the wall of a ruined building, twisting unnaturally, almost as if it was alive. For a second, I told myself it was just my imagination. Stress, fear, the kind of exhaustion that makes you see things. But then, it moved closer. And it wasn't just a shadow anymore. There were eyes, 2 glowing, pale eyes staring out from the darkness. I froze. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like they were cemented to the ground. The shadow moved again, slithering across the rubble like a living thing, and I swear I heard it whisper. Just faintly. A voice. A name, maybe? I sprinted back to the safe house, heart pounding in my chest, gasping for breath. I slammed the door behind me, leaning against it as if that thin piece of wood could somehow protect me from whatever was out there. "Are you all right?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. She'd been here longer than I had, an old friend from previous missions, and even she looked terrified. I didn't know what to say. I couldn't explain what I'd seen, or rather, what I thought I'd seen. But before I could respond, we heard it. A low, guttural sound, like the wind, only wrong. It circled the building, scraping at the windows. And in the dim light of our lanterns, shadows began to stretch and twist along the walls, just like the one I'd seen outside. As the fighting outside intensified, we stayed locked inside, rationing our supplies and trying to stay connected with the outside world. But it wasn't the lack of food or water that got to us. It was the shadows. They came every night, circling, whispering, waiting. Each night they grew bolder, more distinct. And soon, we weren't the only ones seeing them. One of the locals, a man named Yusef, told us stories. He spoke of ancient spirits, cursed to roam the land in times of great bloodshed, drawn to violence like moths to a flame. He called them the haunter of shadows. Spirits of the dead who were never given peace, forever trapped between worlds, feeding on the fear of the living. At first, we laughed it off. Desperation makes people believe strange things, right? But the more we laughed, the more we heard it. That faint whisper in the dark, calling our names. One by one, the other aid workers began disappearing. Some claimed they were going out to search for supplies, to find a way to escape the city, but they never came back. No bodies, no traces, just gone. We tried to call for help, but the networks were down, and no one was coming to save us. We were trapped. By the 6th night, it was just me, Sarah, and Yusef. We hadn't left the house in days, too terrified to even peek out the windows after dark. The shadows were always there now, constantly moving, shifting, like they were waiting for us to break. The whispers were louder, almost demanding. "Come with us," they seemed to say. "Come into the dark." And that's when we saw her, Sarah. She stood up from her chair, her face pale, eyes glazed over like she wasn't even there anymore. She started walking toward the door. "Sarah, what are you doing?" I called out, panic rising in my chest. "They're calling me," she whispered. Her voice was distant, like she wasn't even in control of herself anymore. "They're waiting." I grabbed her arm, pulling her back. She stared at me for a second, eyes wide with terror, before collapsing into my arms. I heard them, Daniel," she sobbed. "They're inside my head. I can't fight it anymore." We locked the doors, boarded the windows, but I knew it wouldn't be enough. Whatever these things were, they weren't just shadows. They were inside our minds, burrowing deeper with every passing minute. The final night came, and with it, an eerie silence. No more gunfire, no more explosions, just the shadows, watching, waiting. Youssef was gone by morning, his bed untouched, as if he'd vanished in the night without a sound. Sarah and I made one last desperate attempt to reach the evacuation point. The U.S. forces were pulling out, and this was our only shot at escape. The streets were littered with bodies, both the living and the dead. But the worst part? The shadows were everywhere now, clinging to every wall, every corner, every crevice, eyes gleaming in the darkness. As we reached the tarmac, I turned to Sarah, but she was gone, just like Youssef. One moment she was there, the next, swallowed by the darkness. I couldn't even scream. There was no time. I ran, the last plane engines roaring behind me. The shadows followed, their whispers deafening now, like 1,000 voices calling out in unison. As I reached the plane, I could feel them at my back, cold and relentless, pulling at me. But I made it. Barely. The door closed behind me, and the shadows vanished in the blinding light of the desert sun. But even now, as I sit here thousands of miles away, I can still hear them, whispering. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more creepy tales based on real events, don't forget to subscribe. And if there's a real-life event you'd like me to turn into a terrifying tale, leave a comment below. Until next time, stay curious and stay cautious.